Hi girls, it's Miss Cartwright. Today we're going to talk about TPCASTTing. Please take notes in the lit terms. Actually, take notes in the writing section of your writing notebook. Alright, so today we want to figure out, what does TPCAST stand for? Why do I care about TPCASTTing anyway? And how do I use this technique? So first of all, what does TPCAST stand for? It stands for title, paraphrase, connotation, attitude, shift, theme, and title. So you might be asking yourself, why do I care about TPCASTTing? It's a way of analyzing a poem. It provides us with a structured set of steps to go through in order to come to the poem's meaning on your own. I find that it's particularly useful for challenging poems. So poems where you read the whole thing and you're like, I don't really get this at all. So I think at this point we're ready to give it a try. Let's roll. All right, first step is title. Okay, for the title, you want to make up a question and try to predict what the poem will be about based on the title. In poems, generally, there are two types of titles. The first one is an interactive title that has some sort of meaning that interplays with the poem. It can change or influence the meaning of the poem. The second type of title is a naming title that just tells us a little bit about the poem, and it does not contain as much information. A lot of times those naming titles are just the first line of the poem or maybe even a number. So if that's the case, you can skip this step. The next step in our TPCAST is paraphrase. Remember, a paraphrase is a restatement of the poem. And so you're going to summarize the poem in just 1 to 2 sentences. The purpose of this is to force you to understand the plot of the poem. You don't need to translate the poem. You don't need to analyze it yet. You're literally just telling me what happens in the poem. If a poem is really long, so like over a page, or if it's really complicated, like it was written by Shakespeare, it is more helpful to write your paraphrase for each stanza. So that's what I'll expect to see in your annotations. That way I can make sure that you understand what's happening in each part of the complicated poem. If a poem is really, really difficult, what I would suggest doing is paraphrasing it line by line into contemporary English, and that'll force you to make sure you understand each word of the poem. You might need to use a dictionary if that's the case as well. The third step of our TPCAST is connotation. Remember, connotation is the emotional meaning behind a word. So when we're looking for connotations in the poem, we're looking for words that have more than a literal meaning. We want to identify our figurative language and see what types of emotions it has attached to it. So we're going to label those. That's the note we're going to be adding into our annotation. After we've labeled the connotations, we want to try to group the imagery and emotions. So is there a dominant type of word or is there a dominant type of emotion in the poem? And you want to add that note to your poem as well. Next, we come to attitude. Attitude is another word for tone. It's another way to think about it is, how does the speaker's voice sound? So here, we're going to think about the speaker of the poem. How does he or she feel about the subject of the poem? And you're going to list a few words that describe the speaker's attitude at the top of your poem. There might be more than one attitude, and if that's the case, you want to list them next to the corresponding parts of the poem. Next, we come to shifts. This is where the poem changes. It could be a change in attitude, in subject, or in motif, which is the dominant type of imagery. Shifts are usually marked by punctuation or by a new stanza. So you want to label the shifts, and you want to identify the changes that those shifts show. So you want to try to characterize them in your notes. Then we return to the title. Now that we've finished analyzing the poem, we want to re-examine the title, this time on an interpretive level. So we want to answer those questions and figure out how the title illuminates the poem. Write this down. And lastly, now that we've read the whole poem and analyzed it, we come to theme. So after we've identified the subject or topic of the poem, we want to determine what the poet thinks about the subject. What is his or her opinion? Another way to think about theme is by asking yourself, what was the author's purpose in writing this poem? Please notice that asking these questions will never lead you to a theme that is just one word, like love. And it will never be a short phrase or a cliche like love is blind. Instead, it will be an argument. Shakespeare shows that love grows with age. All right, so at this point we have learned the steps of TPCASTTing and we're ready to give it a try. Here's my poem, First Grade, which we read in class together. From the title, when I'm thinking about questions, I'm going to ask myself, is the poem about school? Is this poem about being evaluated? Is this poem about beginnings? My paraphrase of this poem is, on the first day of school, the school children think about the beliefs they had leading up to this point. Most of those beliefs are fantastical. In the second stanza, the children question their teacher and her authority. So you can see I'm not analyzing the poem at all, I'm just summarizing the plot. Next, we come to connotation. In the first stanza, I notice a lot of words that really have a magical or a fairy tale or an imaginative connotation. Those words are forest. I think about Little Red Riding Hood, and wolves. That reminds me of Little Red Riding Hood as well. Snowshoes are special, right? You get to wear them just on snowy days. So they have that kind of fantasy attached to them as well. And talking to water is certainly something that is imaginative, that doesn't happen in real life at all. Then I notice that there's one last word that has that same kind of magical or imaginative connotation, which is in the second stanza. The teacher has gray breath. Normally we would expect a teacher to have gray hair, because that's something that would happen in reality, but that gray breath makes her seem like a dragon or a witch, or like there's smoke coming out of her mouth. Also, gray has a pretty strong connotation in terms of its color. It seems to be the color of death or an absence of life or leading up to those deaths. The last word that really sticks out to me, there's two more, are little desks. The note I would make there are that little makes it seem diminutive and insulting. It doesn't really seem cute in this instance, right? It seems like a put down. And occupy are that verb. It's a very sad word. For me, it connotes being there, but not really doing anything. It seems like the desks could be more than school also. They could be the jobs that these students continue to hold. There will always be that woman with the gray breath there. All right, so now that I've done the first two steps, I'm ready to think about attitude. The attitude that I think the speaker has towards first grade is certainly questioning in the second stanza and surprised. In the first stanza, I see a lot of imagination, but it also seems kind of reluctant to give up that childhood fantasy. You can see that until then has that kind of reluctance to it. The shift in this poem is really between the stanzas. The first stanza is before school starts, or describing before school starts, and the second stanza is the first day of school itself. You can also see the shift in the verb tense. The first stanza is in the past tense, and the second stanza is in the present tense. So we start off with that happy idea, and we move to that more serious and questioning stance in the last stanza. The title, so now I get to return to the title. It does seem to be about the beginning, but not just of school, but of preparation for work and life, and a questioning of that life. So for the theme of this poem, I would say that the author, Crotage, seems to point out that school is a place that forces students to conform, but for these students who are particularly imaginative, they're able to question that conformity and possibly also resist it through their imagination. So for this poet, his purpose seems to be that imagination has the ability to enable people to maintain their childishness, even in the face of authority and conformity. All right, you guys, we did it. We figured out what TPCAST stands for, we figured out why we care about TPCASTTing, and we figured out how to use this technique. So next you get to apply it to a couple poems for your homework tonight. And finally, one last hilarious TP-themed image. Thanks, girls.